Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Telling the Story of Our Social World with Data, which is sponsored by Social Explorer. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. For ED users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I would just like to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you may see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can find the buttons for those along the bottom of your screen. And those little buttons will activate and deactivate each of those panels. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions to our speakers. To our speaker today, we'll have time at the end for Quentin to answer those questions. So please do send them in throughout. And if you're having any technical difficulties, that's what you can use the chat box for. Just send me a note and I will troubleshoot the issue with you privately. Today we're using the hashtag ACRL Choice webinars during the event. So if you've got another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a link tomorrow morning sometime to that recording. All right, so to kick things off for us from Social Explorer, here is Jeff Hahn.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jeff Hahn. I'm the Director of Library Sales for Social Explorer, and thank you again for joining us today. Social Explorer is built to empower your students and your faculty with data-driven solutions to their research and to their learning questions. We're a powerful data visualization and mapping tool. All census data is included, American Community Survey data, and other data sets. It's very easy to create insightful and interactive social, behavioral, and health science content for students. So once adopted, we support sort of the development of OER content for your faculty and your students because they can build out content to use in their core courses. All of the interactive lessons that Quentin's going to present today have been developed using Social Explorer. And just as a sample, we support disciplines such as American Studies, Black Studies, Education, Criminal Justice, Health Science, History, Political Science, Social Justice, and Sociology.
Okay.
So go ahead. Would you like me to introduce you?
Please, by all means, yes.
I will be more than happy to. Dr. Quentin Kilpatrick is a graduate from Florida State University, and his research interests are focused on the environmental and personal factors that shape stress exposure, mental health, and health behaviors in the transition from adolescence through adulthood. His research has examined how stress impacts the mental and physical health of individuals across social statuses of age, gender, race, and ethnicity. He currently teaches at Virginia Commonwealth University. We've invited Dr. Kilpatrick here today to share with you how he integrates data and Social Explorer into the courses that he teaches. So now I'd like to turn it over to Quentin. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you all for coming today. I'm Dr. Kilpatrick, and I'm going to go over a few sample modules I've developed with Social Explorer for classroom lectures and also a few data-driven exercises. Okay, so yeah, first I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of going over how I've come to use Social Explorer and the benefits I see. I'm going to go over 3 sample lecture modules that I've developed. The first one is a very broad-based question. How did we get here? And it's a look at race and place across U.S. history with a focus on the early American history. Second, a look at population aging in the United States with a focus on rural America. And third, mapping the historic processes of white flight and more recent gentrification in Brooklyn, New York. And then I have a few examples of how you can use Social Explorer to get students to engage with the data and how that'll work with your courses. So in teaching undergraduate courses, I've found Social Explorer to be really useful as a teaching aid and a format for these data-driven student exercises. And a nice thing about Social Explorer for a discipline like sociology is the multiple ways I can visualize the sociological imagination. This is a concept that's key to intro courses, but it's also a common thread throughout the discipline. It essentially means the ability to make connections between one's own biography and history, or between oneself and one's individual problems to the broader society and larger scale social problems. Now, for intro level courses, I've found there's several features that seem to pique students' interest. One is the ability to zoom in and out, and by doing this, you can visually demonstrate the links between the smallest of areas, say a collection of census blocks in a college town that students might be very familiar with, to the wider world around them. Additionally, I found it very useful in being able to create compelling visual narratives that link the past to today. I tend to emphasize that in undergraduate courses. And then finally, the web-based point-and-click format makes it really easy for students to use because it doesn't require learning code or purchasing an expensive data visualization program like ArcGIS or Tableau. So with that, I'd like to go over a few sample modules I've used. Okay. So the United States has prided itself on being a land of immigrants. However, race and ethnicity have long been sources of contention and conflict throughout American history. Even today, where people live in America is often rooted in historical processes. And this module uses decennial census data as well as more recent American Community Survey data to tell part of that history of where different people lived throughout American history, with a focus on the 19th century and its spatial links to today. And additionally, this module takes a peek at how changing definitions of race and ethnicity over time can quite literally rewrite the map. So with that, I'll begin with the first census. Okay, so at the time of the first census in 1790, the newly independent United States consisted of the original 13 colonies and their land claims out to the Mississippi River, some of which had been organized into various territories, which saw increasing American settlement, notably the Northwest Territories here, comprising the modern states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and parts of Minnesota, and also southwestern and southern territories, which were predominantly Native American or Indian lands. Now, when it came to the early censuses, they made just two distinctions when it came to race, white and non-white. And this reflected the spatial and political reality of the country at the time, as well as the mindset of those who were in power. So when it comes to race, we can see, looking at this county level map of what is now the eastern United States, we see most of the northern United States and these western frontier areas are largely white. So here's Greenbrier County in Virginia, which is now modern West Virginia, almost 95% white. Now, there are some outliers, and you can tell with the data visualization scheme here, the color scheme, the lighter the shade of the county reflects less homogeneity, or a less homogeneous population. So if we zoom in here to the New York area, and we look at New York County, which is Manhattan, we see it's less than 90% white and slightly over 10% non-white in 1790. But if we zoom back out, we can look at these southern counties, and we see that many of them have majority non-white populations. So Caroline County in Virginia, it's 60% non-whites. Charleston County of Charleston, South Carolina, is 77% non-white. So, and this reflects the slave plantation economy and populations of these counties in these southern states at the beginning of American history, or the United States. So I'm going to move ahead to the next few decades to 1820. And here we have 1810. Sorry, 1800 and then 1810. And here's 1820. And we can kind of see across those slides how things have pushed west. So focusing here on 1820, as the United States expanded westward, both white and non-white, free and enslaved peoples moved as well. And by 1820, you can see the expansion of slavery in the South through these recently settled counties of southern Mississippi. So here, like Jefferson County, Mississippi, as well as the relatively recently acquired territories of the Louisiana Purchase, notably southern Louisiana. So if we move into modern-day New Orleans, Orleans County, we see 53% non-whites. So, and then we also, you might notice here as I zoom out, there's a lot of gray in the map as well, particularly western Georgia, western North Carolina, southeastern Tennessee. Now, these were at the time set aside as native or Indian lands, and the United States government didn't enumerate these populations in the census or consider them citizens. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to 1860, and we'll see the United States expand westward while I do this. Okay, so 40 years later, and on the eve of the Civil War, you see that much has changed to the spatial distribution of people in the United States. Those former native lands in the Southeast were no more through a combination of warfare, disease, treaties, and forced displacement, most notably the Trail of Tears in northern Georgia here and southeastern Tennessee. So additionally, the non-white and chiefly enslaved population expanded up the Mississippi Delta region here, all the way up to modern Memphis, Shelby County, Tennessee. And we also see it expanding across this band of the Southeast. It's an area of particularly fertile soil due to the fact that it was on a prehistoric coastline. And this area became known as the Cotton Belt due to the chief crop in the slave plantation economy. Additionally, you might notice some green counties here. These green counties represent majority native counties, chiefly out west and some in the upper Midwest here. And this in part reflects some of the native populations that had been pushed out west, but also some counties that were enumerated for the first time, and native peoples were enumerated in this census. Okay, so here we see this history, and we still see a lot of unorganized or native or tribal land in the whole center of the country, the Great Plains into the Mountain West. Now I'm going to skip ahead to quite far ahead, up into 1980, and we'll take it from there. Okay, So skipping ahead to 1980, we essentially see that these whole native lands have been removed in the middle of the country and become predominantly white. They were open to white settlement. We do see some green counties here in 1980, and these largely correspond with contemporary tribal reservations. So Dewey County, South Dakota, Apache County in Arizona, which corresponds with the Navajo Nation. And this more or less reflects the historical processes of native reservations. Now, another thing to note here is if we zoom back into the Southeast, we see that this cotton belt of majority non-white or African American populations is a lot less contiguous than it was in 1860. And this is in part a reflection of the Great Migration, which was a process which took place in many waves across the 20th century, where many Black Americans in the South left poverty, violence, and political disenfranchisement in the Jim Crow South for some of the rapidly industrializing northern and Midwestern cities, such as Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, among many others, where there were high-paying jobs, and in the strictly legal sense, there were less forms of legal discrimination. So while few, if any, northern counties were majority minority in 1980, we do see that many of these counties have a large minority non-white population. So if I zoom in here to Cook County, Illinois, in 1980, we see it's about 2/3 white, but about a quarter Black, and the rest made up of other groups. And if we move over to Detroit, we see a similar county, or a similar situation here with Wayne County, around 60% white, over a third Black, and then the rest. So I'm going to go back to a different map here in 1980. Now, 1980 sounds kind of arbitrary, but I did choose it for a reason. And this is in part due to immigration and cultural changes in the United States. So in 1980 is the first census where they distinguish between race and ethnicity. And this is a distinction that's not without its own debate today. But for some context, 1960 is the first year that the census let people self-identify their race and ethnic background. Before that, enumerators, census takers decided for people. So I have the same map here of 1980, but you can notice this split screen here. And on the left-hand side is the map that we were looking at earlier. And on the right-hand side is a slightly altered version. And if I slide the map to the left here, we see some emergence of counties in various shades of crimson. Now, we see the South Texas and much of New Mexico, whereas in the previous map, they look much like the rest of the country. When the census included the option to identify as Spanish origin, which is now Hispanic or Latino, it really changes the makeup of the map there. And a part of this is a reflection of 20th century migration from Mexico, but in part it also reflects the fact that many of these areas of the Southwest were Hispanic or Latino before they became a part of the United States. Now, turning to the most recent estimates from the 2017 American Community Survey. Today, we see a slightly modified map, and immigration and domestic migration are reflected in several spatial changes across the continental United States. So we see the growth of more Hispanic majority counties in the Southwest, but also South Florida, such as Miami-Dade County, with its large Cuban population following the Cuban Revolution. And we also see another trend in some highly urban counties where there's no longer a single majority racial ethnic group. So zooming in here to Cook County, Illinois again, we see compared to 1980 when about 2/3 of the population was non-Hispanic white, now that's 42%, and it's still around a quarter Black and a quarter Latino. And if we move over to the most diverse county in the United States, which is Queens County in New York, we see it's pretty evenly split. It's about a quarter non-Hispanic white, a little less than 20% non-Hispanic Black, approaching 30% Latino, and about 25% Asian. So this is a process that we'll probably see in more highly urban counties in the United States, depending on factors of migration in the coming decades. Okay, I'm going to switch back here. Okay, so I'm going to move over to the second module here, which is taking a look at population aging in the United States. So, excuse me. So population aging is a phenomena occurring in many industrialized societies. Some countries, notably Japan, are actually experiencing population decline in addition to aging. There are multiple factors that account for this that we'll expand on shortly. But as populations age, there are fewer working age adults relative to elderly adults, which presents society-wide challenges to funding social programs such as Social Security, and more localized issues such as transportation and access to specialized health care. So with that being said, the United States is aging, but it's not aging evenly. Some parts of the country, specifically rural areas, are aging faster than the rest of the country. So before we examine the spatial distribution of population aging, it's good to go over the components of population growth or change. Population change between 2 points in time in a particular geographic area is rather straightforward. It's measured by taking the population at time 1, adding the sum of births and deaths, and adding the sum of in-migration versus out-migration. Now, in geographic areas where you have low fertility, which tends to be a total fertility rate of less than 2.1 births per woman, and where you have negative net migration, so more people moving out than moving in, that can really lead to not only rapid population aging, but also population decline. Okay, and I'm going to switch over to the module in Social Explorer. Okay, so again, for a historical overview, in 1940, just 6.8% of the U.S. population was aged 65 or older. But as life expectancy has increased and birth rates among both the native and foreign-born have declined, the United States has experienced population aging over the past century. So scrolling through this map, this county-level map of the population aged over 65 in 1940, we do see some regional patterns. The southeast and much of the west is fairly young. So Coconino County in Arizona, just less than 4% of the population is over 65. We do see some areas in the north and Midwest, though, that are beginning to show some older populations. And the oldest county at the time here is Shelby County, Missouri, which over 15% of the population was over age 65. But more or less, you're looking at a fairly young country. And this is reflected in, again, high birth rates, but also in previous decades, high rates of immigration as well. Okay, moving ahead, 1960, we see it begin to age a little bit more, particularly here in the Great Plains and Midwest. Moving to 1980, and we see this spread further. The year 2000, and 2017, and I'll zoom in here. So by the mid-2000s, most counties, all counties in fact, had experienced increases in the elderly population. Now some of these students could do here is identify parts of the country that have particularly high percentages of elderly adults. And they can look at whether or not these counties tend to be more urban or rural based on population size of the total population. So again, looking through here, we see a few hot spots. We see the upper Midwest. These counties in red tend to have high percentages of elderly people. So up here in the upper peninsula of Michigan and even the upper main part of Michigan, we'll look at Montmorency County here has 30% of its population over age 65. But if we look at that base population, it's less than 10,000 people. So this is a pretty small rural county. And students can also identify a few other hotspots here. So we see, again, parts of the Great Plains, parts of the Mountain West, parts of Texas, the Ozarks here between Missouri and Arkansas, as well as southern Appalachia here, this area around Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. All of these are approaching 30% of the population over age 65. And we also see another hotspot in Florida, and that's due to a largely retirement population. So Marion County, Florida, where Ocala is also approaching 30%. So here, I put in a filter variable, and this is an exercise students could do and something I've done in the class before. So I've already identified these few regions, the upper Midwest, the Ozarks, southern Appalachia, but they don't show up on this map, and that's because I put in a filter. So I'm going to go into Edit Project here, and I've already put it in, but I'm going to go over here. If you wanted to identify maybe a problem or a potential area for problems, you can add a filter to really narrow the way the map looks here. So what I was interested in looking at was looking at counties that have a high percentage of elderly people, but also have less than roughly 50% of the median household income of the United States as a whole. So this would identify two criteria: a large elderly population, but also relatively low income or wealth in the area that could provide services for an aging population. So I scroll down here to filter areas by criteria, and I've already put this in, but I've selected median household income in 2017 dollars, and I made it less than $36,000. So, and what this did was removed a surprising amount of the hotspots of elderly population that I had identified previously. So almost none of the upper Midwest is now visible. Much of the Mountain West is gone as well. But what we do see is some of these counties in the Ozarks, so Ozark County, Missouri here, is still over 1/4 population over age 65, and also has less than half of the median household income. So the Ozarks here, and also southern Appalachia. So again, these counties in Tennessee, Kentucky, these areas tend to have a lower percentage of elderly adults. So we're looking at Bell County, Kentucky here at around 18, but they also have very low median household incomes. So by putting in this filter, you can really kind of identify a few hotspots where the challenges of dealing with an elderly population may be particularly acute in coming years. Okay, and I'm going to switch back. Okay, and so for the third module here, wanted to look at contemporary issues of gentrification and uh, uh, race and ethnic inequality, as well as class inequality in the United States. So, as a background, it's important to look at gentrification. It's a hot topic, and it's contentious but an important issue, and it reflects these contemporary issues of housing affordability, race, and class in the U.S. So while this is a contemporary and ongoing phenomena, it's important to understand the earlier processes that created the urban landscape of today. And unfortunately, a lot of these processes included housing discrimination, de facto segregation, as well as post-World War II suburbanization and white flight. And these are key precursors to the changes that we're seeing today. And I'm going to switch back over to Social Explorer. Okay, so here is a census tract map of the New York metropolitan area in 1950. And you can see it's rather limited because the census didn't have census tract data for all of the metro area at the time. But as an overview, here is the racial ethnic map of New York in 1950. So despite not having de jure segregation or segregation enforced by laws, New York City was highly segregated by race in 1950. Discrimination in housing and employment meant that many Black Americans had very few places to live in the city. So outside of Harlem, the neighborhood, which is up here in above, this is Central Park here. So we see Harlem here. Outside of Harlem, Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, and St. Albans neighborhood area in Queens, there were very few areas where Black people would be rented to by landlords. Now, in the post-war metropolitan areas across the United States, as well as New York, suburban construction boomed, and millions of Americans took opportunities provided by government loans and other programs to leave crowded cities. However, unequal access to new home loans, restrictive covenants, and other forms of discrimination made it so that these opportunities were not available to all. And these historic processes profoundly shaped neighborhoods across the U.S., and their impacts remain evident today. So we can visualize some aspects of these broader trends by focusing on the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn. And I've put in two maps here. We're looking chiefly at 1950, but by dragging across, we can look at the changes from decade to decade. So just to reiterate, a green census tract here would refer to a majority white census tract, or roughly small area of a neighborhood, whereas blue would represent a majority Black neighborhood. And the relative shade of the color scheme indicates how homogeneous a particular census tract is. So as we move from the page from 1950 to 1960, what we see at first looks like the growth of Black neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and chiefly around this Bedford-Stuyvesant area. However, in many of these areas, it's not just a period of in and out migration, so white people moving out and Black people moving in, but it's also a process of population loss due to overall suburban development. So to illustrate these patterns of changes, let's examine three census tracts across time. We've got two majority Black census tracts adjacent to majority white census tracts, and we're going to look at population census tract 243 here, and then census tract 383, and then one majority white census tract 163 here. So let's see, looking at census tract 243, we see in 1950 it is 75% black and 25% white. Look at census tract 383, we see it's roughly the same. And this one census tract here closer to Prospect Park in central Brooklyn, we see it is almost 99% white. Now, as we scroll across to 1960, we see that census tract has become nearly a quarter black, but not only that, it's lost some residents. So if we look at, it's got 4,300 residents altogether in 1950, and in 1960 it has 3,200 residents. So it's lost a substantial amount of people, and this reflects the history of people moving out, the people with opportunities moving out to new suburbs developing in Long Island and New Jersey. So you can zoom in a little bit more here. And I'm looking at census tract 241 here. Same thing. We see it's got 3,000 people in 1950, and it's become majority black in 1960, but its population has declined somewhat. Okay, now more broadly, if I look at the changes from 1960 to 1970, we see again the growth of majority black census tracts, but we're also seeing a decline in the overall population in many, but not all of these census tracts. And this process played out in many cities across the United States. So now we look at 1970 to 1980. And then with 1980, if you'll remember from before, with the inclusion of the ethnic category in the census, we see how that inclusion really changes the map of what New York looks like. So let's see here. So if we just look at two groups here in 1980, we've got, if we just look at white and black, it's 50% versus 6% in some areas here of northern Brooklyn. But when you include Spanish, Hispanic, or Latino identity, we actually see that a lot of these areas are becoming majority Hispanic. And again, that gets at the nuances and the difference between identity of ethnicity versus race. And then we also see Chinatown here as well, reflected in majority Asian or Pacific Islander populations here. Okay, now I'm going to skip ahead to the year 2000. So from 2000 onward, you can actually start to visualize the signs of gentrification, particularly in neighborhoods closer to Manhattan and closer to subway stations. Now, gentrification is a multifaceted issue that deals with money, reinvestment, class, but one element that is easy to visualize is race and ethnicity. And something that is a little difficult to do in terms of income is looking at housing values or median household incomes, because inflation changes the real dollar values of those over time. But so anyway, we're looking at the year 2000 here, and as we scroll across to the year 2010, we see this western area of Brooklyn start to become majority or plurality white again. And in many of these areas, this is the first time since 1960. And if I scroll ahead to 2010 to the 2017 ACS estimates, we see this process continue at a greater pace. So we're seeing these sections of Western Brooklyn become majority or plurality white for the first time since the immediate decades after World War II. But at the same time, we see another factor as well, which is that these census tracts in these neighborhoods aren't one group or the other like they were in the pre-war era. So while some of these census tracts are becoming more white, they're also not becoming majority white. So they're becoming somewhat mixed. And that is something that is going to play out in New York City for some time to come, from what I understand. So, and I'm going to switch back. So, and obviously, as these processes continue, we're dealing with the legacy of wealth inequality. But again, one maybe positive element is that there's less hypersegregation now than in previous decades. So, okay, with that, I'm going to go into, looks like I'll have time for one of the exercises to look at how you can use Social Explorer to get students to do exercises and really kind of engage with the topics that you're teaching in the course. And let me just scroll ahead here. Okay. I'm going to switch back to Firefox. Okay, so in this exercise, you can have students look at the changes across time in the face or the age of who's poor in America. And that reflects some key political decisions in the 20th century. So for a bit of a background here, in 1964, the federal government launched the War on Poverty, and for the first time developed a poverty rate based on the typical cost of living at the time. So, and they included factors such as housing, food, transportation. And for our first look here at regional patterns of poverty, first we're just going to look at family poverty. So, and if based on the census, a family is a group of two or more people, one of whom is the householder, related by birth, marriage, or adoption, and residing together. So this first map here shows the percentage of families living in poverty in each state in 1970. And that's the first decennial census to include measures of poverty. So, and are there regional trends evident? Yes, very clearly there are. Chiefly the South, and in particular Mississippi, has the highest rate of family poverty in the continental United States, with about 29% of families living below the federal poverty lines in 1970. Now, as I move it to 2017, using the same color scheme, we see immense changes. So just to go back, dark red would indicate higher poverty, lighter shades less, and then the more blue, the lower the poverty rate. So Mississippi, almost 29% of families in poverty. Compare this with Michigan, we're looking at 7.3% of families living in poverty in 1970. Now, compared to 2017, it looks a lot better. It really does. Mississippi's family poverty rate now is almost half of what it was in 1970, so a little less than 15% of families living below the federal poverty line. And in Michigan, it's increased slightly to near 10% of families living below the poverty line. And now, as is evident in pretty much all things, when you look at state averages, they tend to mask a lot of regional variation within the states. So here I'm looking at the same 1970 map of poverty, but at a county level map rather than the state level. And we see some regional trends that are really driving this. So much of the South, and much of this is part of that former Cotton Belt, but also these large chunks of southern Appalachia, Kentucky, and West Virginia, and parts of the Mountain West and South Texas have very, very high poverty rates. So if we look at historic coal country here in eastern Kentucky, about 31% of population of families are below the poverty line. Now, I mentioned seniors, and as a part of the War on Poverty, the Social Security Act of 1965 launched Medicare, which was a taxpayer-funded national health insurance program for adults aged 65 and older. And in part because of Medicare and income redistribution programs such as Social Security and supplemental security income, the percentages of elderly living in poverty have declined dramatically since the 1960s. So, again, looking at Mississippi, we see that over nearly 55% of adults over the age 65 were living below the federal poverty line in 1970. And in Michigan, it was less than a quarter, so less than half of the Mississippi rate. Now, if we compare that to today, using the same color scheme, we see substantial reductions in elder poverty. So in Mississippi in 2017, we're looking at about 13% of elderly adults living below the poverty line. And in Michigan, we are looking at a little over 8%. So and what's actually happened is that it's declined substantially in both places, but the reductions have been more pronounced in areas that had higher elderly poverty rates in 1970. And again, that's chiefly in the South. So again, we can look at this in terms of county level, and I'm using the same color scheme here. And basically, you see a United States of red. Many counties in the United States have poverty rates for elderly people above 30, above 40%. And if we switch that to today, we only see a few pockets. Again, reflecting historical processes, we're looking at southern Appalachia, again, parts of Kentucky, South Texas, parts of the former Cotton Belt, and parts of the Great Plains and rural Mountain West. But we can compare this to, as opposed to looking at the old, we can also look at the young, and looking at, unfortunately, we don't have child poverty data from the first census to include poverty data in 1970, but we can look at it from 2000 on. So we can look at a 17-year spread. And if we look at, let's look at Mississippi again. So in Mississippi, we've got, in 2000, we had about 27% of children under age 18 living in poverty. And in Michigan, we're looking at 13%. Now, if we switch that to the year 2017, we actually see rises in child poverty, more or less around the country, but we see that slightly more, we see around 30% of children in Mississippi are living below the poverty line in 2017 versus 27% in the year 2000. And we also see increases in Michigan. So it's jumped from nearly 14% to nearly 22% of children. And this in part reflects these historical processes and these programs that have reduced poverty for the elderly across time, but perhaps a dearth of programs that have led to the increase in child poverty and made younger the face of poverty in the United States. So, okay, well, with that, I want to thank you and open it up to questions and comments. And Jeff, if you want to hop
Sure,
in here.
I'll jump right in. Hi, everyone. We did have one question come through, and the question was, could you lay different data sets on top of each other to create a map? And what Quentin showed earlier is the fact that you can put the maps side by side. That's a tool that we've built. And then you can slide back and forth. So you could have aging data on one side, you could have poverty data on the other, and slide back and forth and see how they correspond either by county or by state and so forth. So that's how we have that set up. I'm wondering, if anybody has any other questions at this point, you could put them into the Q&A or the chat function. That would be great. Chat would probably be best.
It looks like I have one on showing the initial steps to creating the story map board.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
That'd be great.
I can go over that.
Yes.
So, why don't I can go ahead and start a new project. So here on the main Social Explorer webpage, you've got a series of options. You have maps. You can create reports by pulling the data and create stories. So what I'm going to do here is create a new story. And I'm going to grab just the United States data. There's several options, and not just census data, but we have election data, crime data, business patterns, environmental summaries, health data.
Quentin?
Yes.
Do me a favor and share your screen so everyone can see.
Oh, good thinking. Let me switch that over.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me go back here to reiterate. So here's the main Social Explorer page and how you can go about creating the storyboards. So you've got my maps, my reports. You can actually pull the data into a report way, and then stories. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new story. And we've got United States data, census data, but also a lot of other data you can pull from too. Election data, crime, environmental summaries, health data, and cancer data, and religion data as well. So let's take a look at religion. We'll pull up religion data. This is from the it's not a government survey, but it's from the year 2010. A survey of religious affiliation and participation in the United States. So here I've got a state level map, and it looks like we're looking at the adherence rate of the total population. So estimates of the number of people who claim to be an adherent of some type of religious faith. In Michigan, it's 42%, Mississippi, 58%. So I'm going to change the data, scroll down here to religion, and I'm going to look at adherence rate of a few different major religious groups in the United States. So we'll look at evangelical Protestant, Black Protestant, mainline Protestant, and Catholic. Those account for the majority of religious affiliations in the United States. And I'm going to change, you see the geographic level here, it's got it by state set automatically. I'm going to switch that to county. And here we see a really interesting regional pattern to religious affiliation in the United States. So we see in blue is evangelical Protestant. So let's go to a county we're familiar with. Let's go to Shelby County, which I brought up earlier. So it looks 28% evangelical Protestant, 16% Black Protestant, a little less than 10% mainline Protestant, and just about 6%, 6.5% Catholic. And you see down here in the bottom left-hand side, we've got our board showing us the relative density or the percentage population of these different groups. So Black Protestant is in orange, and again we can see some majority or plurality Black Protestant counties in that same former cotton belt of the southeastern United States. Mainline Protestant here, so these would historically be Presbyterian or Lutheran churches. We see these mostly in the northern United States. And then we see Catholic in this crimson. So much of the Northeast, parts of the upper Midwest, and also much of the Southwest as well. And interesting split here. If we look at southern Louisiana, you see the split between the historic French Catholic regions of Louisiana and the more evangelical Protestant northern parts of Louisiana. So if we let's look at Cameron Parish, 55% Catholic, but just a couple counties up, 2 counties up in Beauregard Parish, it's over 50% evangelical Protestant. And again, there's a whole story, a history of religious settlement and religious differences and where people settled in the United States that you can just kind of quickly put that together. And, it provides a really interesting visual. So, okay, and I'm going to switch back here. Let's look at a few other questions for the short amount of time we have left. Can you overlay the race map over the aging map? It seems like the young blue counties are Native American properties. I imagine, counties. So let's see if I can do that real quick. Edit this project. Looking at, so here I'm going to change the map type here. So it might be a little hard to see, but in the far bottom right corner, I'm going to change the map view.
You need to share your screen again.
Thank you, Jeff. My bad. Okay, going back to sharing on Firefox here. Okay, so here we had this 2017 race ethnic map of the United States, and in the far south or the far bottom right of the map here, you see change map view. And I'm going to switch it to a swipe. So right now it's got the same, it's showing the same map, but I'll change the data to look at population age. Let me move this. We'll look at population under 18. Okay, click. So kind of hard to tell on this one. The color scheme's a little different. You have to play around with it, but you do tend to see some. So here's this county is let's look at Dewey County, South Dakota here. All right, so some of these Native American counties. Let's actually go to the Apache County here. We see it's majority Native American. And again, this overlaps with the tribal Navajo Nation. So we're looking at it's about 3/4 Native American, and its aged population. It's about 28% of the population is under age 18. So the trend there isn't as easy to pull out, especially because so many counties have aged in the United States. But there are some overlaps where there are younger populations, especially some Mountain West and traditionally LDS counties tend to have higher populations of young people as well, which is in part a reflection of large families compared to other counties. So explore trends like that, and you can really kind of explore a visual correlation, so to speak, between different types of socioeconomic and demographic variables. So I think that's pretty useful. I'm sorry that one didn't work out as well, but there are a lot of interesting trends like that. So.
Well, it's nice. It shows people how you can do side-by-side map, swipe back and forth, do comparisons, and you see the comparison data when you click on a county or click on a state. So that's a very nice presentation.
Exactly.
I think we're sort of at the end of our time. I want to let everybody know that if you had given us a question through Q&A or chat, I will get those questions from Mark, and we'll answer those for you and email you the answers within a week.
All right.
You want to jump back in?
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. And just a quick thank you to you, Quentin, for really just a very interesting presentation, and to you, Jeff, for facilitating it there and doing the Q&A at the end. Just would remind folks that are still on the line with us that you should see a link to a survey in your chat box. If you could take just a minute or two to fill that out and let us know how we did today, we would really appreciate it. And I think the last thing that we really need to do is to thank all of you out there for your time today. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you on one of our upcoming webinars. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.